Imagine as a hypothetical thought experiment, an alien anthropologist were to visit the United States and Canada today to study their culture. They'd find a rich and diverse culture, one with strong ties to Northern Europe, especially the British Isles. However, they'd find almost no evidence for the native culture, and this isn't the case in a lot of nations in the Americas, be it Argentina, Cuba, or Brazil, where you find very little evidence for the native cultures, be it genetic or cultural. This seems funny when you look at the Americas before Columbus. They were often very populated and advanced. Mexico in 1492 had a larger population than France, and the Inca Empire had a larger population than Germany. Both continents together had a total population of likely 75 million people, with some wiggle room. There were amazing architectural and structural wonders, ranging from Machu Picchu to thousands of years it took to breed corn. This wasn't to last. Europeans, mainly English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, conquered and in many places replaced the native population until even the fragments that they ever existed became rare in many places. How were the Europeans able to conquer the Americas, and how could it have changed? The main reason is disease. The natives were not adapted to European diseases, which the Europeans gained immunity from due to their close proximity to domesticated animals the natives didn't have. This meant that when the Europeans arrived, that sometimes 90% of the native population were wiped out by disease. This left the native kingdoms weak for European conquest, and left less populated land simply open for European settlement. For example, when the Pilgrims showed up in Massachusetts, they were actually entirely empty villages and fields for them to settle. The lands were completely denuded of population. The second reason was the superiority of European weapons and animals. I say animals because cavalry was actually the most useful of all European military techniques, because the natives didn't know how to deal with horses. Cavalry, gunpowder, and steel all combined to give the Europeans a marked military advantage over the natives. To get this timeline to start, I'm going to make it so that the first of these doesn't happen and hope the second isn't important enough. In this timeline, an especially diseased ship from Europe washes up on the shores of New England in the 14th century. This spreads disease throughout the two continents so that by the time the Europeans show up in 1492, the natives are already adapted to European diseases. This would prevent much of the European conquests. Both Pizarro and Cortez were able to succeed because disease crippled the native forces. As mentioned before, the English colonists were able to settle much of the 13 colonies because the land was already denuded by disease. However, even without this, the Europeans would likely be able to settle parts of the Americas. It seems hard to believe the Spanish with their guns, steel, and horses wouldn't be able to defeat the mainly pacifist Taino peoples of parts of the Caribbean, for example. So let's use suspension of disbelief to say the Europeans don't colonize any part of the Americas and leave the entire thing to the natives. So what if the Americas were never colonized? What if the native cultures remained dominant throughout the two continents? What would borders be like? What would culture be like? What would the world be like? That is the question of this alternate history. This alternate history covers an enormous area, and so I'm going to cover it region by region originally, rather than chronologically, starting in Mexico. The center of Mexico in 1492 was mainly dominated by the enormous Aztec Empire, with smaller states like Tlaxcala and Teotihuacan. The large Tarascan Empire countered the Aztecs to the north. To the north of them, in turn, were the warlike but poor nomadic tribes like the Chichimeca. To the south of the country, the Yucatan was settled by fairly primitive Mayan chiefdoms. The few cities that remained after the collapse of Mayan civilization were controlled by warlords from the north and center of the country. Central America, meanwhile, was inhabited by relatively primitive peoples living simple agricultural lifestyles. The introduction of European technologies would completely change this balance of power. In general, pre-Columbian empires were pretty small. The Aztec Empire, for example, was only half the size of France, and they were the second largest. This is because they didn't have horses or steel tools to make the taming of nature easier or to make travel easier. Without horses or an easy way to construct roads, the distance and supply lines that could be maintained were much smaller. Armies couldn't travel as far from the capital or borderlands as they could in Europe or Asia. Without horses, communications across the empire and maintaining connections with the capital were harder. The Inca were kind of the exception to this rule, having an amazing road system and a courier system for messengers. Even so, the Inca Empire was less than two-thirds the size of the Roman Empire. This arrival of horses and steel for clearing the forests would allow the enormous Aztec Empire to expand and conquer the weaker surrounding states. Doubtless, European weaponry would also be expensive, meaning that only the most powerful American states would be able to afford it, thus giving the Aztecs even more of an advantage. The Aztecs would be able to conquer the surrounding states like the Tlaxcala and the Mayan tribes, using their military advantage against the landlocked Tarascans. They would likely turn the barely settled Central America into vassal states. To the north were the nomadic tribes like the Chichimeca. The introduction of horses would make these tribes a nightmare, like the Sioux or the Comanche in later years further north. As it was, the Spanish fought a 40-year war against them in our timeline, which they didn't really win, only making the Chichimeca vassal states of the Spanish. The Chichimeca to the north would prevent the Aztecs from moving north for the 16th and likely much of the 17th centuries. Further north in North America, the balance of power was quite different. California and the West Coast were inhabited by hunter-gatherer peoples, many of which were quite advanced, but nonetheless hunter-gatherers. The deserts, mountains, and plains west of the Mississippi were also inhabited by primitive hunter-gatherer peoples. The exceptions were some farmers who lived near the shores of the Mississippi, in the plains, and the peoples of the Southwest, like the Pueblo, who were an irrigation-based people who built some amazing monuments like Chaco Canyon. East of the Mississippi were mainly forest-based tribes like the Iroquois, Shawnee, and Algonquin. They were agricultural, warlike, and the best possible comparison to the Old World would likely be the tribal peoples like the Slavs and Germans during the Roman Empire. On the Mississippi and in the south were the Mississippian peoples. They reached their height around 1000 AD, but were still hanging on in 1492. They were in decline, but had large cities and advanced cultures. They were really hit hard by European diseases in our timeline, which is why you never hear about them. And they generally devolved into tribes like the Cherokee or the Chickasaw. Flanking the entire north of these two continents were the primitive hunter-gatherer peoples in the Arctic. The balance would again switch with the introduction of European technologies and animals. European technologies would reach the East Coast first, thus giving those tribes an advantage over those further west. We would see the move of eastern tribes conquering west until those western tribes would in turn get European technologies and attack the tribes west of them, thus continuing the pattern. You would probably see the European powers and maybe the Aztecs play the native tribes off against each other in proxy wars, like what happened in our timeline in America and what happened in India, with different European nations picking different native groups and playing them off against each other. If you look at the really big picture, it wouldn't be that different from our timeline. The Iroquois would still become dominant, subduing a region stretching from the Mississippi River to Vermont and from Quebec to Kentucky. In our timeline, the Delaware of the Mid-Atlantic were Iroquois vassals. This would likely continue in this timeline, with the Iroquois gaining dominance over the Mid-Atlantic. The Delaware would definitely have the resources to resist, but were too pacifistic to likely do so effectively. Without the French in Quebec, the Huron in Wisconsin and Canada wouldn't be able to get gunpowder supplies from Europe and France, their ally. The Huron were the Iroquois' main enemies in our timeline, and so would be crushed. With the Iroquois so powerful, it would create balance of power issues. The Cherokee, Creeks, and Chickasaw, as well as other southern peoples, would likely form an alliance against the Iroquois. The small Algonquin tribes of New England and the Canadian Maritimes might form an alliance against the Iroquois to maintain their independence. If not, they would become Iroquois vassals. The main battlegrounds would likely be in Kentucky and the Mid-Atlantic. The Shawnee of Kentucky were the largest vassal group of the Iroquois, and the Cherokee would try to break them off from Iroquois domination. Meanwhile, getting the Delaware to break off from the Iroquois would cut the Iroquois off from the Mid-Atlantic and connect the Algonquin of New England with the Cherokee of the South. The Mississippian peoples would still go into decline, since it was happening before the Europeans arrived. The more gradual process would mean southern tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, and Chickasaw, however, would be more advanced in this timeline, with them having more of an urbanized economy. The introduction of horses would make the plains into horse nomads like the Mongols. This happened in our timeline with tribes like the Comanche, Sioux, and Arapaho. Without the central U.S. government that existed in our timeline, the horse tribes would raid into the Aztec Empire and eastern forests, wreaking great havoc. Further north and west, the hunter-gatherer peoples would be too primitive to adopt Western technologies, and so would be stuck in the Stone Age. In the Caribbean, we would see the Carib peoples slowly gain dominance. Before 1492, the aggressive Carib peoples were migrating into the Caribbean from South America. They were slowly replacing the pacifistic Taino people, who were the native inhabitants. With the introduction of European technologies, especially naval ones, the process would simply be expedited. We would see a ring of Carib kingdoms stretching from the northern edge of South America through the Caribbean. Fun fact, the word cannibal comes from Carib, for one of their nastier habits. Now into South America. The Inca Empire immediately looms large on the map, stretching from the jungles of Peru to Chile. It was the largest empire in the Americas at the time, with a large military and advanced construction abilities. The southern part of the continent was meanwhile settled by primitive hunter-gatherer peoples. The jungles in the north were also mainly settled by hunter-gatherers, with some cities and kingdoms on the Amazon, deep in the jungle that we're only now discovering. Meanwhile, in central Brazil, there were many semi-nomadic farming peoples, which, because I don't speak Portuguese, I have absolutely no knowledge on, besides that they exist. Like our timeline, the tribes of the South American grasslands, the Pampas, would take to horses and become horse nomads like the Sioux. The Inca would gain similar benefits to the Aztecs in ability to expand their empire. However, they'd have far less directions to do so. In most directions lay the unfarmable jungle, and in others lie deserts and impenetrable mountains. They would likely spread north, along the Andes into Colombia, into what is now the mountainous heart of our timeline's Colombia, as well as a little bit into Bolivia. Trade with Europe would import African diseases into the Americas, which would turn much of the jungles uninhabitable. The reason the natives could build cities in the Amazon, but you'd be lucky to survive a week, is that the importation of African diseases has turned the jungle uninhabitable for urban life. This is also why the Mayans could build enormous cities in the jungle, but the Panama Canal couldn't be built until 100 years ago, when the medicine came into existence to fight the diseases. This is one of the reasons why Africa is so underdeveloped, that until 100 years ago, in most of tropical Africa, diseases would just wipe out any major city. This would slow down the advancement and development of much of northern South America and Central America for hundreds of years in this timeline, much like our own. The semi-nomadic tribes like the Guarani would probably create kingdoms like those in North America, but as said before, there is almost no information on these people, so I can't talk that much more about them. This alternate history is so enormous that I have to split it into two. The second will bring the timeline hundreds of years further into the future, and also talk about this timeline's effects on Europe and the rest of the world. Please stay tuned for What If the Americas Were Never Colonized Part 2.